to speak up?
Nope, we're all good. So, ahoy and welcome in to Not Allowed to Die, your podcast about mental health, where I, Dan Maigler, social worker and life enthusiast, answer your questions about mental health. Alongside me, as always, is Mariska, the three-toothed Patterdale Terrier, and she is licking her paws. You'll hear her a little bit in the background. Mariska always wants me to remember to bring attention to Paws for Patrick. So if you know a young person who might benefit from having a little animal love in their life, reach out to pawsforpatrick.org and the person can be assigned a wish granter who will help them connect with an emotional support animal. Today, Mariska is super excited because, as you know, she always loves it when we have a guest. And this guest is someone I have been eagerly anticipating for a while. Former member of Team Maigler, who just off the charts charisma. We always had fun and laughter during any of the times that we talked. So today, I'm excited to welcome Damonique Richards here to talk about both her reaction and different experience with adoption than one of our other guests that we had on before, and also some of her work with supporting people who are going through traumas in the emergency room. So, Dominique, so happy to have you here today, and just so excited to hear your perspective.
Thank you for having me as well. I also have a dog who is licking her paws behind me. So it might be my dog or your
Okay,
dog.
it could be dueling licking paws.
Yes, yes. And
Well,
I'm just, she started while you were talking. And I was like, yeah, okay.
and I'm guessing it makes your dog's paws feel better as well if people rate and review the podcast and follow it in addition to both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you follow because that makes what's your dog's name?
Eve.
Eve. So Eve will feel better. Mariska will feel better. We'll all feel better. Anyway, so back to you, and so excited to have you on with us.
Thank you. I'm a shy person. So I was like, oh, I'd love to do a podcast with Megu, but I don't know if I would ever be brave enough. But I guess I decided I was brave enough. So I was 8 when I was placed into foster care. My foster parents ended up adopting me when I was 11. So you're right. My experience with adoption is a little bit different than the average person. I know a few adopted people, they were all adopted when they were babies. And so for me, it's like I know where my parents are. I knew where they were when I was in foster care. And I was thinking about this yesterday because I knew I was going to come on here. I was thinking about is it because I know a lot of people who are adopted, they want to know their biological parents. Where for me, I knew them, and I was given up when I was older, right? So I think I was 10 when my biological parents, like, they wrote me a note saying that they gave up their rights and I was like a child of the state. And I was trying to think, like, is one way or one path, quote unquote, better than the other? Because I don't question where I came from. There's no mystery behind it, but I had to deal with being adopted like in real time, like as a person who's like walking and talking and I have thoughts and opinions. And I was just, I want to know, I'd love to talk to other adopted people about that. Like, would you want to already have the relationship with your parents and then they give you up, or not, and then wonder about that behind after the fact? If I ramble, I'm sorry. I'm just
No, I find myself that you have siblings, and
yes.
you were by yourself in the home that you ended up with. You weren't with any of your siblings, and
Mm-mm.
so some of your siblings did some of your siblings end up with relatives, or others end up in different
Yeah.
foster homes. So
So
tell me a
my
little bit about who ended up where and how that all worked.
yeah. So my biological grandmother became the legal guardian of all of my other siblings. So they all ended up in one spot, and then I was way over here. And I used to have a very hard time with that when I was younger, because I was like, dang, like it was like almost like a double whammy. Like my biological parents gave me up. That sucked. In hindsight, very happy that that happened. But then it was okay. Now I'm here, and now later on in years, my biological grandmother took all of my kids, so they all ended up with like living together with my grandmother. So then it was like, oh, like, and I'm still over here though.
Hmm.
Um, but everything turned out great. Like I would not change anything. I love my parents so much. I'm glad that they wanted to adopt and do the foster care thing, and I'm glad that my siblings ended up with my grandmother because they ended up with a relative and they ended up with someone that I knew and already had a relationship with. So I wouldn't change anything for sure.
Yeah, I think did you ever see that movie with Mark Wahlberg where they are a couple deciding in their I think it's somewhat loosely based on a true story of deciding whether or not to become foster parents. And I think you would be the poster child for making this wanting to be a foster. And also, I know your adopted parents and they are wonderful.
Mhm.
But I think for a lot of people, it isn't always that great. And a lot of
Mhm.
people that I've worked with going through the system, they're in 5, 6, 7 different foster placements. Some of my clients have been abused in different foster placements and things like that. So
Mhm.
I think one of the things you said before you came on, though, is even from when you were young, maybe it was because of the way your parents explained it or whatnot, but you were clear it wasn't a lack of love that led you to be put up for
Mhm.
adoption. It was, we love you so much that we want to make sure you have a more stable home and a better
Mhm.
opportunity. And
Mhm.
so for you, and again, wanting to say that not everybody who's adopted carries that feeling and that feeling of rejection or
Yeah.
this idea that I wasn't enough or I wasn't good enough. So how did any things about like in your childhood that made you feel like, no, I know this, it isn't because my grandmother doesn't want me there, or it isn't because whatever, this is all because they want me to have the best opportunity. Anything that like made that come home to you or helped you to feel that way?
Yes. Let me put you on mute because my dog is about to start barking. So
Okay.
I
So
just gotta like,
we'll prepare. We'll
yeah.
handle the dog and the barking. See, that's one nice thing for all you listening. You never hear Mariska barking. And that's because Mariska only barks when she's sleeping. She sometimes has some dreams. There's some adventures that she's having, which wouldn't we all love to know what our dogs are dreaming about? But
Mhm.
yes, we don't ever hear a Mariska bark, but that's that
Yeah,
nothing to worry about.
my dog don't bark, but when she's looking outside and I
Mm,
guess there's people outside and that she started doing her pacing and her huffing. I was
yeah.
like, you about to start barking. So, um, come here. Just lay down. Just lay down by me. You're okay. So yeah, I always growing up viewed it more like when you're adopted as a baby, it's because your parents felt like they didn't have the resources to give you the life that they want you to have.
Hmm.
So for me, when my biological parents gave me up for adoption, it was not give me up for adoption. Sorry, when I was placed into foster care when I was 8, and as an adult, my mindset is, man, I should have been adopted when I was a baby
Hmm.
because my childhood was so bad. And to go for me again, I was lucky. My adopted parents were I only was in one foster home, and then when my biological parents gave up their rights, my parents swooped in like right
Hmm.
away. I think the process from like reading that note saying that I was a child of the state to being adopted was maybe like 2-3 months. Like
Hmm.
my mom didn't hesitate. um but as an adult, I'm like, man, like I feel like I could have avoided so much trauma as a kid if I was adopted when I was a baby. um that was my opinion. I think other people are going to have different opinions, but I think that because when the choice to put your kid up for adoption when they're a baby, I feel like is such a hard decision,
Hmm.
and many people um don't want to do it, or they feel like they're bad parents, or they love their kids so much that they're thinking about their feelings and how they would feel if they gave up their kid. Where my mindset has always been as an adult and just going through the system of like, I don't know if my biological parents should have had kids.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know if they did the right thing. I mean, we're all here, we're all okay, and that's such a blessing. But I definitely look at it like, oh, like, would it have been smarter to give us all up for adoption or just not have had us because of the trauma that we all went through when we were kids? And again, my story ended so well.
Hmm.
So it's like I'm aware of that, and that is a privilege, the way that I was taken care of when I went into foster care. And I know my story is not like a lot of people's. Um, but because of that, I've just always looked at it like, oh man, like your parents loved you so much. They try to do right by you right away. versus trying to do right by you years after the fact and after the abuse and the trauma, and then putting you up for adoption or
No,
putting you in foster care and then adoption later.
Yeah, I think it's such a hard decision
Hmm.
for every individual to say, when is it, because people, they want to show that love and care for the choosing to bring this child into the world. And I think
Hmm.
for many people, it feels like a sense of failure if they
Yeah.
have to give their child up for adoption. I know one
Hmm.
of my clients who he was in the foster care system when he was a teenager. He and his girlfriend, they ended up getting pregnant and they gave their child up for adoption, and it was an open adoption, and they ended up getting married, and they're in their later 30s now, and they have a daughter who lives with them, and she's 16 now, but they still have contact with their son,
Hmm.
who lives in Nebraska now. And I think that those open adoption situations are often the best if you can maintain that. But I think it's also very hard to know that there's this part of you that's somewhere else in the world, and
Hmm.
you don't have control over how that person's being raised. For yourself, do you ever think to yourself, well, maybe when I'm older, would you ever consider being a foster parent? Or is that something that you're just too early a stage in your life right now to say whether or not that might be something you'd be interested in?
No, I definitely want to adopt. And I tell any person that I'm like talking to or dating, like I plan on adopting. Um, I'd like to ideally have two kids of my own, and then if I'm financially stable enough to adopt a third or have a third kid, I'd want the third kid to be an adoption.
Hmm.
So it's kind of actually like a requirement when I go into like when I meet men and like we're talking and like seeing like,
Hmm.
oh, could this be serious? Could I marry him? That's something that I always bring up.
No,
Like,
and I think it's a really important thing that you have to bring up relatively early, because many people are,
mhm,
they balk at the idea of having a dog or having a pet, so the idea of saying like, okay, first of all, do you want kids at all? Secondly, would you
mhm,
want more than just your own biological children? And because if people, I think, feel like they're taking a major risk. And I think any kind of parenting is a risk and it's a challenge. But I think knowing that someone who has been somewhat through the system is saying, yes, I would be interested in extending that on to other people and supporting them
mhm,
in that way. It's as
mhm.
good an endorsement, I think, as we can give, that maybe if people are curious, they should learn more and research what's that process to become either a foster parent, what's that process of adoption in their community. Now,
It's-
oh, go ahead.
oh,
You know what you want to say?
sorry. I've asked my parents about
Mhm.
it, like, and I know to be a foster parent is I think it's like it takes a lot of time,
Mhm.
a lot of paperwork, a lot of trainings you have to go to, and adoption is even harder. Um, so yeah, and I remember I asked my parents because I'm mixed race, and I was like, "Did you want a white kid?" My mom's like, "No, we didn't care." Da, 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 da. And then I saw the paperwork and it said prefer white, and I was like, "What is this? What is this?" And she was like, "I don't remember that. I don't remember that." But like I said, there's a lot of joking, and obviously, I never had to have that conversation of like, "Honey, you're adopted." It was kind of like, "No, I was there at the court, and I changed my name," and it was there was no elephant in the room kind of thing, which was awesome or funny, I guess. But
When you also didn't have to deal, because you'd had previous life being raised, with your parents, you didn't
mhm,
have as many questions. I know for a number of people who are adopted who say, one of my wife's good friends was was adopted from Korea by a white
mhm,
family, and saying
mhm,
this difficulty of, okay, culturally, I'm not really sure who I am and where I stand at this point, because visually they look like they're a Southeast Asian person,
mhm.
but they have no cultural context for that. So in your case, because you had contact with your siblings, contact with your family and community, that was less of an. But was it ever weird and awkward living in like this very white community that you were then raised in as a
Mhm.
mixed race person? How was that for you?
Um, I think I think the any like concerns I had, it was never related to being adopted. It was more of just being a black person in an all white town.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. I culturally because when I moved to my hometown when I was 8.
Hmm.
And I just lived there until I moved out as an adult. Um, I think that my culture was like white people culture.
Hmm.
So it didn't really change anything. But I think when you're mixed race and if like things are odd or don't go your way or people don't like you, you have that like voice in the back of your head. It's like, oh, is this because I'm not white or I don't have like blonde hair or blue eyes? Like
Mhm.
you never really know if like someone's treating you a certain way because you said something that hurt their feelings, or if they just don't like you, or they rub you the wrong way, or because there's like racism involved. Like you just don't know. Or like sexism, like it's like a woman thing too. Like is this
Mhm.
person, like is this man being disrespectful to me because I actually did something to offend him, or is it because I'm a woman?
Mhm.
So yeah, and like there were times where people were like openly racist towards me, but I feel like I was surrounded by so many great people, like that if I complained, something was done about it. So it wasn't, yeah.
How about on the opposite end, when you found yourself, especially, you know, in your teens or college or whatnot,
Hmm.
in then all like groups of all African American people, did it ever feel like you weren't black enough or things like that because you had spent so much time being raised in this really white community? Or was that a relatively easy, you know, to feel like
Yeah.
you could move between groups?
That's such a good question. When I started meeting my college friends and they were black people, or black college students, they pointed out how whitewashed I was. So like when you're in white
Mhm.
culture, you don't really notice it. Like the
Mhm.
obvious difference would be like foods that you eat or music that you consume, but they would point out stuff like on a daily basis that I would just think, doesn't everybody do this? And they're like, no, that's just white people. Um, but and there was a lot of white jokes. There's still a lot of white jokes. But I think something when it comes to, and I heavily identify as a black, like if someone's like, oh, what do you identify as? Because I'm mixed race, I just say black.
Mhm.
Um, but that took a while in itself because I felt weird claiming to be black, but I had no black friends. I didn't like culturally I wasn't. Um, but I'm well read now, well versed in a lot of social issues and things like that. But it wasn't hard. Like it wasn't like, oh my God, this is so tough. Um, and it wasn't like, oh, I don't fit in either. It was just pointing things out and then being like, oh, okay. Um, but when I was younger, I had a lot of self hate because I was half black. Um, but it wasn't because I was black specifically. It wasn't like, oh, I don't want to be black. It was more like, oh, I'm surrounded by all these white people and I'm not white like them. And it
Mhm.
made me feel like I was like sticking out. I didn't want to stick out. When I was a kid, I really, really just wanted to blend in and be in the background
Mhm.
and not be noticed. But it's really hard to not be noticed when everyone else is like blonde and blue eyed, you know? So I didn't like that I was black when I was a kid, but it wasn't specifically that I was black. It was just, it could have been a whole bunch of Asian people. And I'd be
Mhm.
like, man, if I was just Asian and I could just hide in the back, like, or if I was all like around all Hispanic people, if I could just, I don't know, I was very like, didn't want attention when I was a
Right,
kid.
just wanted to be under the radar.
Hmm.
Which is actually, though, it's a little bit funny for me to hear because in our interactions from the time you were, you know, 14 years old or whatnot, I've never told you this, but, you know, when we would speculate as to what your future career would be, you had
Hmm.
some interesting and outlandish ideas on that. But I really thought maybe you'd end up being like a comedy writer or something else like that because just, you know, just the subtle,
Hmm.
just constant humor that was coming through you.
Hmm.
And when you eventually in college and we stayed in touch, and when you told me about that you were volunteering, and that's I want to shift a little bit, but like
Hmm.
you've taken some of like life experiences and said, like, I really want to go out and help people and, you know, make a career and things like that. So one of the things you did that I've been so fascinated by, and I've actually dragged you into the high school so you could come to some of my groups and tell kids about this volunteering opportunity you've done. But you got trained to be a volunteer and do this resiliency work so that you could sit with people in the ER who had gone
Hmm.
through a trauma. So can you talk a little bit about what made you interested in that, how you found out about it, and what the experience is like of helping be with people who are going through some of the worst times of their life? So anything you'd like to be willing to share about that?
Yeah, so I want to say I was maybe a junior in college, and I was talking to one of my friends. who I believe to be somewhat socially awkward. And she was telling me about this volunteer work that she does. And I was like, man, like if she can help people, like I want to help people. I was kind of inspired by her. And so I looked it up because I wasn't sure if the type of work that she was talking about happens in Chicago. And then I found what is known as they changed their name, so I gotta remember. It's right now it's called Resilience, but before I think it was called like Rape Victims Advocacy, RVA.
Okay.
And so I researched into that, found out that they had this training. And if once you complete the training, you're a certified sexual assault crisis counselor in the state of Illinois. I don't know if that expires. Mine might have expired. Um, and so I remember that the classes would the training and would interfere with my college classes. So I remember I went to my professor and I was like, hey, every Tuesdays and Thursdays, would it be possible if I can leave like 20 minutes earlier? And he was like already mad. He's like, why? And I told him what I was trying to do. And he was like, absolutely. Sneak out the back. I don't care. That's amazing work. And then this was the first day too. And there was like a line of people behind me. And he said, if your excuse is not as good enough as hers, don't even bother asking. And I was just like, right. And so I ended up signing up for the class. It was 4 hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They have sessions 4 times a year. So they call it like their spring, summer, fall, winter sessions. I think I was in the winter group. Yeah, because it was going into my second semester. But basically, they train you on how to be in the ER with survivors of sexual assault. And they had this interview that you had to do, I think, before you actually got accepted into the training, because they want to make sure that you wouldn't be like biased or like have like your own personal opinions about certain things, because you don't know who you're going to have to help.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be man, woman, straight, gay, adult, child. So they want to make sure that you're not going to come in with your own biases and like try to put your own opinion or spin on things. They want to know that you're just here to help anybody and you're willing and able. And I think it was 60 hours. I think other locations, I remember they said other locations that kind of provide the same training to do the same thing were 40 hours, but theirs was 60 hours. And I think they might have been the first. They're now called Resilience. So I think Resilience might have been the first like organization to do something like this. And I know that their mission was that survivors would come into the hospital to get these rape kits done, and they would leave the hospital worse off than when they came because of the treatment that they were receiving. And so Resilience mission was to have someone stationed with them at the hospital to help that whole process of like, hold on one second.
Well, and that's, I'll just speak. I did a 40-hour training on sexual assault volunteering so that I could work a hotline to do other things like that. But I'm assuming that the additional 20 hours that you went through were getting pretty specific on that role at the hospital, because obviously I didn't have any training on that role and that part. But so continue on.
Yeah, so we had to do oh my God, it was so hard for me because when I get nervous, I get funny. So we had to do like all these serious scenarios of like what you might encounter if you're called. And it is a volunteer basis, and they ask that you volunteer at least, I think it was twice a month for the first year. So 24 times in the year. But yeah, there's a lot of training on like talking to nurses, talking to sane nurses, talking to the patient or the survivor that you're with. They went into detail about what a rape kit is, what it's supposed to look like the proper way to swab. Instead of just like rubbing, you have to like rotate the entire Q-tip so that it, the whole Q-tip touches the skin. Otherwise, you might like lose DNA. and like how to make sure. And it was weird because, sorry, they're vacuuming my hallway. Hopefully
It's
you guys
okay.
can hear that. But it was just to make sure that like and the nurses are great. I've never had a problem with nurses. They're very educated on this, but it was like in case you encounter like a biased nurse or like a person that maybe doesn't believe the patient, which again has never happened, but like just making sure like how they put like the evidence in the bags and the scraping of the fingernails and how to help the survivor when they're going through this, because like the whole rape kit is really just re-traumatizing
Mhm.
to the survivor. And that was something, my first time that I was called, because you sign up for on-call shifts, so either you are called or you're not. And I primarily signed up for children's shifts because nobody wanted to do them. And I was like, I'll do them. So like my bag that I had like stuff for kids. So it was
Mhm.
like crayons and coloring books and things like that, colored pencils. But yeah, that was a lot of the training was, talking to officers too and investigators. So I
Mhm.
had like police officers come, investigators come, and I had to give my statement of what I was told, and if I was willing to testify about what I saw here. So like there's like reports with my name on it. Nothing's happened, but
Mhm.
one day I might get called. I don't know. So it was really in depth, and it was very, very educational too, because they went over like what like the perfect witness, the perfect victim was
Mhm.
versus the perfect predator, or was, and how, who, like if it's a white man versus a black woman, a black man versus a white woman, how
Mhm.
those two scenarios would play out differently at court, and how just those two scenarios from the moment that the person walks into the ER, how they'll be treated all the way up until like if they do want to press charges, like how it could just be different because of like racial bias, or like the perfect victim is someone that they didn't know the perpetrator, and
Mhm.
like they weren't drunk, and they were super covered up, and it
Mhm.
was the middle of the day, and it was just the spontaneous crime that happened. That's pretty much the only way that
Like
everybody
somebody
would
jumped
even
out of the
do it.
bushes and it was like,
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
and how rare that actually is
yeah.
in real life experience. But
Hmm.
now you mentioned the idea of a sane nurse, and I want to make sure people are listening. It's not meaning a nurse that's not insane. We're talking about
Yeah,
is it a sexual assault nurse educator? Is that what sane stands for?
yeah. Sexual assault nurse
Oh,
examiner.
nurse examiner. And so these are people who've gone through extra training in nursing. And there's in the Chicago area, there's lots of them, but people might be in an area where there isn't a sane nurse on staff. So having a volunteer there who has the kind of training that you went through would be
Hmm.
so critical to helping even those medical professionals who want to do a good job supporting people,
Hmm.
but they might not have had all that training and education. And God forbid something that's already so traumatizing gets screwed up and a case isn't able to go forward and whatnot. So
Yeah,
you're partially this advocate to make sure everything is staying on the rails, but also more, maybe mostly, to just be that person of support for
yeah.
this person and this advocate, whatever they
Hmm.
need, and helping them understand what the process is going to be. How was that for you? And like, how long might you be in the ER? Or like, would you just be at your house and get like a call, or would you just be sitting reading a book in the ER in case somebody came in? Like, how did that work?
So I was at home.
Hmm.
Um, I signed up for overnight shifts. So you can do AM, PM overnight. I was overnight child shift. So that's what I would do. Their whole thing is they want to train you for any scenario.
Hmm.
So even though I picked children's shifts,
Hmm.
I was trained for adults, people with disabilities,
Hmm.
which this, your largest targeted population are people with disabilities. Um, and then the religion too. So you
Hmm.
have to not be biased about if they're Muslim or
Hmm.
Christian, or things like that. Um, but I think for me, the first time I did it, I was so nervous I broke out in hives while at the hospital, because I remember I did not want to say something
Hmm.
that triggered them or made the everything worse, or like I never wanted to make a person regret coming into the hospital. So like that was my big thing on my mind. And so for me, I got to a point where when I would go in and I would introduce myself, I would tell them, like, do you need someone who's super emotional with you, or do you need someone that's very matter of fact? Because I think when you're in such a traumatic situation, like, not every way that someone comes to help you is going to be beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when I'm super upset, I need people to be very matter of fact. I don't want you to hold me. I don't
Mm-hmm.
want you to hold my hand. I don't want you to tell me everything's going to be okay. Like, I need you to be so unemotional so that I can, like, almost help regulate myself. But some people, if you come in super like
Mm-hmm.
by the book, writing down their information, that's going to make everything worse. So I got to a point where I was like, let me know how you need me to treat you.
Mm-hmm.
And that helped me so much, because I think one time I was there for maybe only like 2 hours, and I had to leave because I was coming down with the flu. And I was like, and
I don't need to also give you the flu on
yeah,
top of everything
so
you've been through.
I had the flu, and then someone else there was another resilience volunteer there for another person, and she was looking at me like, you are sick, you need to go home. And I was like, can you help me and be with my person too? And
Mm-hmm.
she was like, yeah, of course, I'll stay for both of them until they can bring someone. So the shortest time that I was in the hospital was like 2 hours. I think on average it was like maybe 5 to 6, and then the longest time I was with someone was for 13 hours in the hospital.
Wow.
um and they are willing to switch you out if it's like that long. They'll be like, but I just didn't have any, like, I didn't have any plans. I always picked up on like Friday or Saturday nights where I knew I didn't have to do anything the next day in case. But that person that I was helping, she was someone that needed that emotional side,
Mm-hmm.
which is a little bit more harder for me to do. But I knew I did okay when she was like, can we hang out? Like, you were so amazing. Like, can I get your number? And I had to ask my my supervisor at the time. I was like, am I allowed to give out my number? And they're like, if
Mm-hmm.
you want to, that's fine. So I actually kept in touch with her for maybe like a month or two after that, just to make sure she was okay. But like, another big aspect of the volunteer work is telling them what services are available,
Mm-hmm.
and like what services they're legally allowed to have. Like, so there's services that resilience will offer you, and
Mm-hmm.
then there's the services that like the state has to offer you.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of it is we had to know the laws regarding survivors of sexual assault, which is pretty cool. So something like, if it happens at your apartment, you're allowed to break your lease.
Wow. Okay.
you know um and if it like, and then the service, like any health stuff that happens, survivors do not have to pay, so they're not supposed to get any medical bills for that. They're allowed 4 walls, so they're second priority to people who are dying. So they're gonna get you in a room as long as there's no one else that's literally like on their deathbed or whatever. So these are like laws that like Illinois has, and then there are services that Resilience has, which is like therapy. They had, I don't know if they still do it, but if you were an immigrant, they'll help you try to get like your citizenship, was something that they did a lot of awesome stuff. I couldn't even name it all, but a lot of what my job was telling them what was available to them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had like this big packet I had to fill out, and I was like, you can answer all these questions. You don't have to answer any of them,
Right.
but and then we did stuff like call them back like a few days later. So it was a lot. Like, it's all coming back to me now because I haven't done it in maybe a year or two, but it was very, very rewarding work. But yeah, my biggest fear was like, man, I hope I do not say something to them that makes them regret coming to the hospital to get help. And something that I did, if anyone is watching this podcast and then God forbid something happens to them later, something that I do want people to know is you can get a rape kit done, but you don't have to have it tested. So right now, I don't think in Illinois there's no longer a statute of limitations for rape. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you get raped today, hopefully
Mm-hmm.
no one does, but there's never like, oh, well, you didn't say anything about it for 5 years, now you can't do anything about it. I think they completely eliminated that. double check that
Mhm.
before you post this. Just in case I'm wrong, you can say it at the end. Um, so in Illinois, I think is the head of like how they respond to survivors of sexual assault. At least the time that I took the training and got certified, like they like a lot of what we do, other states follow after. So
Mhm.
I'm actually very proud to be Illinois
Yeah,
because we did do that right. You know,
right.
our
We
taxes
don't
might be really high, but
yeah, we don't have mountains, we don't have anything cool like oceans, but we do have some good things.
mhm.
Now, I don't know if you'll remember, but and I because I don't know the answer to this, but do you have any recollection of about how long from the time of an assault a rape kit can still be done and be able to get any
Mm,
material that's potentially useful? Like, would you say if something happened to a person, 2 days before, is it not is it still worth it to them for them to go into the ER? Is it probably if it's more than 30 hours, is it
mm.
like a little
I
bit safer?
think the biggest thing will be if the person showers.
Okay.
If you still have clothes, if you haven't showered, things like that, obviously you want to get it right away, or you want to go right away to get it done as soon as possible. But I think they had said like and this was in my training where they talked about how there was a survivor, um, and she felt so dirty that
Mhm.
she took like several showers and then decided to go. Um, and they had swabbed the inside of her nose
Okay.
and they had DNA from that because
Wow.
she was washing her whole body, but I guess she didn't blow her nose in like the 3 days that and so they found like DNA inside her nose. Um, and then, like, again, like, a lot of the times, it's not even about the time. I think it's about how if they're swabbing things properly, because they were saying how a lot of people were so positive they'd be DNA on them, but they weren't swabbing right, so they were
Mhm.
swabbing one side, but then if they took the sample from the other side or something like that, it would come up negative. So all these people were coming up negative for having DNA on them, and then they switched it up and, like, made sure they got the whole entire cotton ball on
Mhm.
the swab, and there was a difference after that too. But I would obviously say right away, or if you're not comfortable going right away, keep your clothes. Or and I know it sounds awful, but like try not to shower. Like if you need time to process and like sit in your living room or whatever, um, yeah, try not to like wash everything off. But I think they're like if because they do a thorough job. Um, But yeah, probably go right away is probably the best.
But it sounds like this, even though you're obviously not doing that volunteer work currently, there
Mhm.
was a lot of benefits to you in knowing all the information that so that if you're
Mhm.
ever dealing with a friend, family member who's going through these type experiences, you can
Mhm.
better educate and advise them. Now, I know in the part you kind of referred to this in the training, they are trying to make sure and looking not only for people who would be negative and judgmental, but also making sure that no one's going to traumatize themselves by being
Mhm.
that kind of support.
Mhm.
And so, is there anybody that you would say, yeah, you probably shouldn't want to try to volunteer for this if you're still actively working through some of your own sexual
Yeah.
trauma or things like anybody who would say, yeah, maybe hold off on that if or what any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people who go and do this is because they're survivors themselves and
Hmm.
they want to help people the way either they were helped or the way they weren't helped.
Hmm.
So, and that's something that was brought up too, is they say, have it be like if you were sexually assaulted, they want people to wait at least a year before they take the training. And then on top of that, they had therapy for people that were actively signing up for shifts. So if you were doing a lot of shifts, they would like check in on you, and then also they had like I don't know how frequently it was, but they had like group therapy sessions for their volunteers. So their volunteers could come at like a set time and just talk about the things they've seen, how it's impacted them. And then they had individual therapy too. So they really take care of their volunteers. They want them educated and they want them healthy too. So,
Well, it's so important because again, I think a lot of people, whether we're talking about going into doing being a foster parent or going and providing this service, if we're not supporting the people who we want to be these
mhm,
frontline caregivers, then people are going to be intimidated to try. And the
mhm.
more that we're taking care of those people, then we're going to have them for multiple needs and multiple years, hopefully. So yeah.
Mhm.
Well, anything else about there are some other I could have you on for a million years, and there's some other topics that we might talk about with your career in the
Mhm,
future. But
mhm,
anything else for today that you really want to share with everybody about, whether it's back to adoption, foster care
mhm,
system, or resilience and this kind of thing that you just want to share with the audience?
mhm. So with the adoption thing that we were talking about, I want to be very clear. Like, I know that my perspective is not going to be everybody's perspective. And I also know, like, the situations that I were talking about where I said things like, "Oh, I just feel like if you do give up your kid for adoption as a baby, that probably means that, your parents really, really loved you and wanted best for you." I know that that is not going to be the case 100% of the time. So I don't want anybody thinking that I'm saying this for every person that's ever been adopted, that is how it is. I know things are very situational. My opinion is, generally speaking, to make that tough call and to think about your kid's future in that way, I think that shows love, not, oh, I don't like this baby, because honestly, you're a baby. You don't have a personality. You're not talking. They're not going to look at you as a baby and be like, I don't like this baby. Like, I don't think that that's what's happening in their head. And then for the, um, volunteer work that I did with resilience, something that they said, and something that we always had to tell the people that we were working with, was two things: was, this is not your fault, and you did not deserve this.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of shame and a lot of, oh my God, if I had just done this differently, or did I ask for this, or is this my fault, happens when you're a survivor of sexual assault. And that was, like, literally what we were taught. You have to say this, because, and that's the truth. Like, you did not ask for this. This is not your fault, and you did not deserve it. So those were the big things that I wanted to.
No, I appreciate that because we can never say that one enough. That and
Mhm,
no matter and I find myself I'm very annoying and very repetitive with people, and you've experienced this, but that the idea of you don't get special rules. And if you're
mhm,
saying, well, no, I deserve this because I did X, Y, or Z, I put myself in this position. We always want to be asking, well, would you think anybody else deserved that?
mhm,
Wouldn't you think that that person, even if they had gone back to that person's room and they had made this decision to drink, wouldn't they have the right to say no and stop? Or even if they said nothing, if they didn't want
mhm,
something to happen, it doesn't mean that your boundaries weren't violated, and
mhm.
what happened to you matters. So, well,
Can I add one more thing?
sure.
Um, I very much believe that there is a reason why we blame ourselves, because if we blame ourselves and we say, "Oh, if I had done this, I had done that," then it's like a way of controlling the situation, and
Hmm.
it's a way of telling ourselves, like, "Oh, I can make sure this doesn't happen again." And then the idea that, "Oh, it's not my fault," means that this could happen to me again, or this was random, and that's an uncomfortable idea. So I
Hmm.
know why people do it, like, on a subconscious level, but it's also like, oh, well, you shouldn't be blaming yourself. And the
Hmm.
person that blamed is the perpetrator who did it. Um, so yeah, I just want to add that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, again, if you have questions for Dominique, I'm going to stay in touch with her because it's a treasure of my life to be still in touch with. So you can email me at dmaiglerlcsw@gmail.com. If you have questions for Mariska, you can also pass those along there. And until we speak again, do whatever it takes to get you through this world. And remember, you are not allowed to die.